Patrick smiled at his mother, and she smiled back. Somehow, that was the moment the wedding stopped feeling like a wedding. Until then, everything had felt ordinary. The pianist had just begun to play. Guests were rising to their feet. Barbara was walking toward the altar while Patrick kept straightening his jacket with the quiet excitement of someone who believed he'd finally found peace. Then Margaret slowly stood. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look upset. She simply waited. Barbara reached for Patrick's hand. He never seemed to notice. Margaret quietly asked if she could say something before the vows. No one looked worried. No one expected a scene. Patrick's smile disappeared before his mother had even said another word. Welcome to the Greer Stories. Thank you to everyone who has supported this channel and helped us grow. We truly appreciate every one of you. If you're new here, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and become part of our growing family. People always described Patrick and Vivian's marriage with the same quiet confidence. They'll be together forever. No one said it because they looked glamorous. They said it because Patrick and Vivian never seemed to make life difficult for each other. They worked hard, laughed easily, remembered birthdays, showed up for family dinners, and always left holding the same door for one another. From the outside, they looked like two people who had already figured marriage out. The truth was much quieter. Every morning began almost the same way. Patrick left early for his architecture firm. Vivian left a little later for the hospital, where she managed departments that never seemed to stop needing her. Long day? Patrick would ask. Vivian smiled. When isn't it? He laughed. I'll try to beat you home. You won't. I know. Neither of them noticed something had changed. Years earlier, that same conversation usually ended with another question. What are you worried about? How are you really doing? Tell me what happened yesterday. Now, those questions never came. Not because they didn't care, because they believed there would always be another evening, another weekend, another chance. At work, Patrick spent his days restoring buildings everyone else had given up on. Vivian spent hers helping people through the worst days of their lives. Both became experts at solving problems. Neither realized they had quietly stopped bringing problems home. One Thursday, Patrick walked past a small flower shop. He paused. Yellow tulips. Vivian once mentioned they reminded her of spring mornings when she was a little girl. He smiled and bought them. No occasion, no apology, just because he remembered. When he stepped into the apartment, Vivian was already on a hospital conference call. She looked up. Her face brightened. She pointed to her headset. 5 minutes? Patrick nodded. He filled a vase, set the flowers on the table, started dinner. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the hallway. Vivian's voice drifted through the apartment. Move the staffing meeting. Call me back. We can't leave the floor uncovered. 5 minutes became 20, then 30. By the time she walked into the dining room, Patrick had already turned the stove off. She saw the flowers. Her smile softened. I'm sorry. I know. I really thought. I know. She reached for his hand. He squeezed hers. Neither of them argued. Neither blamed the other. Vivian wanted to ask, Are you disappointed? She didn't. Patrick wanted to ask, Can we stop letting work win every time? He didn't. Instead, Saturday? Saturday. It sounded hopeful. Saturday came. Work came too. The conversation never returned. Weeks later, Patrick couldn't remember exactly when the tulips had wilted. Vivian couldn't remember exactly when she'd stopped noticing fresh flowers on the table. Neither memory felt important. Individually, they weren't. Together, they were becoming a pattern. Family still admired them. Friends still pointed to them whenever someone asked what a healthy marriage looked like. They never fight. Patrick's mother smiled every time she heard it. She believed peace meant happiness. Patrick believed it too. So did Vivian. No one asked the question that mattered most. When something important went unsaid, where did it go? The answer wasn't obvious. It didn't disappear. It simply waited, waiting inside unfinished conversations, inside postponed evenings, inside ordinary moments where two people chose the practical question instead of the honest one. What time will you be home? Did you eat? Can you pick up milk? Those questions always found answers. The others never did. Patrick and Vivian still loved each other. Deeply, faithfully, but without realizing it, they had begun replacing curiosity with routine, not because love had disappeared, because they had quietly started believing there would always be tomorrow. Neither of them could see it yet, but long before Barbara entered their lives, long before divorce papers, long before a wedding where an entire room would fall silent, their marriage had already begun changing in the smallest possible way. The important questions were no longer being asked, and unanswered questions have a way of waiting until someone else is willing to answer them. Patrick spent his career looking for cracks, not the obvious ones, the tiny ones, the kind hidden behind walls or buried beneath years of careful renovations. He often told younger architects that buildings almost never collapsed without warning. They always whispered first. Most people simply didn't know what they were looking at. Vivian often smiled whenever he said that. You make buildings sound alive. They are, he'd reply, if you pay attention. The strange part was that Patrick had become remarkably good at noticing weakness everywhere except the one place he loved most. At home, he stopped asking questions because he believed strong marriages didn't need constant inspection. He mistook quiet for stability. Vivian carried a different habit home from work. Every day at the hospital, she asked difficult questions. What aren't you telling me? When did this start? What changed? She knew lives could depend on answers people were afraid to give. By the time she came home, she wanted the opposite. She didn't want another difficult conversation. She wanted peace. Without realizing it, both of them left the most important parts of themselves at work. One evening, Patrick noticed Vivian staring through the kitchen window while the kettle whistled behind her. She didn't seem upset. She simply looked elsewhere. He almost asked what she was thinking. Instead, another thought arrived first. She probably needs some quiet. He walked over, poured her tea, kissed the side of her head, and returned to answering emails. Vivian watched him walk away. She almost smiled. She had actually been hoping he would ask, not because anything terrible had happened, because she wasn't sure why she'd felt so distant all week, and saying it out loud might have helped her understand it herself. The tea was thoughtful. The silence stayed. A few days later, Vivian picked Patrick up from the office after his car was left at a construction site. He slid into the passenger seat carrying a rolled set of blueprints. They approved the restoration. That's wonderful. He nodded. It took months. Vivian waited. She expected him to tell her everything. Instead, he looked out the window. You hungry? She looked at him for a second. Sure. On the drive home, Patrick talked about traffic, road closures, and a new coffee shop near the office. He never mentioned the project he'd spent nearly a year fighting for. Vivian quietly wondered why. Patrick quietly assumed she wasn't interested. Neither assumption came from anything the other had actually said. Their lives continued fitting together almost perfectly. Vivian still remembered to buy Patrick's favorite cereal before they ran out. Patrick still woke first during winter storms to warm the car before Vivian left for work. They still thanked each other, still apologized, still laughed. But something had changed beneath those ordinary kindnesses. They had begun protecting each other from conversations they believed might become burdens. Patrick no longer wanted to bring home frustrations that couldn't be solved. Vivian no longer wanted home to feel like another hospital meeting where difficult questions always demanded difficult answers. Love was still present. Curiosity wasn't. One Sunday afternoon, Patrick found an old notebook while clearing a shelf in the study. Inside were pages from the first year of their marriage. Lists of places they wanted to visit, restaurants they wanted to try, questions they'd once written for each other after reading an article about keeping relationships healthy. One page simply read, "What do you think we'll be like in 10 years?" Patrick smiled. He couldn't remember either of them ever answering it. Vivian walked into the room carrying folded laundry. "What did you find?" He looked down at the notebook. For a moment, he thought about showing her, thought about asking the question now. Instead, he closed it. Nothing important. Vivian nodded and carried the laundry upstairs. Neither noticed that one quiet decision said more about their marriage than the notebook ever could. Margaret noticed small things other people missed. Not arguments. There weren't any. Not coldness. There wasn't much of that either. She noticed that Patrick and Vivian had become unusually careful with one another. They interrupted each other less, disagreed less, questioned each other less. From the outside, it looked like maturity. Margaret had been married long enough to know another possibility. Sometimes people stop asking questions because they trust each other completely. Sometimes they stop because they're afraid the answers might change everything. She never shared that thought. It wasn't her marriage. Not yet. By the end of that year, Patrick and Vivian still believed they were protecting what they had built together. They couldn't see that every question left unasked created a space where certainty slowly gave way to assumption. And once people begin living with assumptions instead of answers, they rarely notice the difference until someone else asks the question they should have asked each other years before. Barbara had never imagined she'd become part of Patrick and Vivian's routine. She had always been Vivian's friend first. The kind of friend who remembered birthdays without social media reminders, showed up with soup when someone was sick, and quietly washed dishes before anyone noticed they needed washing. After taking leave from work to care for her father during cancer treatment, her days became strangely empty between hospital visits. Vivian refused to let her spend those afternoons alone. "Our apartment isn't that far from the rehabilitation center," she said. "Come over whenever you need a break." Barbara did. At first, it was once every couple of weeks, then every Sunday. Eventually, no invitation was necessary. She simply knocked, walked in, and called out, "I'm borrowing your coffee again." Patrick would answer from somewhere in the apartment. "You know where everything is." "I know. You reorganized my pantry." It needed help. It absolutely did not. Vivian would laugh from the kitchen. "You two argue like siblings." Those afternoons became something all three of them quietly looked forward to. No one saw danger in them. There wasn't any. Not then. Barbara had one habit Patrick barely noticed at first. She remembered the answers, not because she had an extraordinary memory, because she genuinely listened. One Sunday she asked, "Did the city ever approve that restoration project you were worried about?" Patrick looked up from the grill. "They finally did." Barbara smiled. "I thought they'd come around." Patrick laughed. "So did I. Eventually." The conversation lasted less than a minute. By evening, Patrick had forgotten it. Barbara hadn't done anything remarkable. She had simply remembered something he'd mentioned weeks earlier. The following weekend, Patrick arrived late after visiting a construction site. Barbara looked up from helping Vivian chop vegetables. "How's your shoulder?" Patrick stopped in the doorway. "My shoulder? You said it had been bothering you after climbing scaffolding." He rolled it once before answering. "It's actually much better." "Good." Barbara went back to slicing tomatoes. The conversation ended. Patrick stood there for another second before walking into the kitchen. Later that night, he realized he couldn't remember the last time anyone had followed up on something so ordinary. It wasn't an emotional conversation. It wasn't important. It simply made him feel noticed. Vivian noticed things too. She knew when Patrick needed stronger coffee after a difficult week. She knew which shirts he avoided wearing because the collars felt too tight. She knew exactly how long to leave his toast in the toaster. Love had never disappeared from their marriage. Curiosity had quietly been replaced by memory. She no longer asked because she believed she already knew. Patrick had done the same thing. Neither realized people change in small ways every single day. One rainy Tuesday, Vivian was delayed by an emergency meeting at the hospital. Patrick and Barbara waited at the apartment. Barbara wandered toward the bookshelf. "You still have this?" She pulled out a travel guide to New Orleans. Patrick smiled. "We bought that our first year of marriage." "Did you ever go?" He stared at the cover. "No." "What happened?" Patrick shrugged. "I honestly don't remember." He thought about it for another moment. Then he smiled to himself. "No, that's not true." Barbara waited. "We kept saying we'd book it when things slowed down." "And did they?" Patrick laughed quietly. "I guess not." Barbara nodded once. "What a shame. It looked like a good trip." That was all she said. No advice, no judgment, no attempt to make the conversation deeper. She simply turned another page. Patrick found himself wondering why such an ordinary question had stayed with him all afternoon. That evening, Vivian finally arrived home, looking exhausted. Barbara packed her things. I should head out. Vivian hugged her. Thanks for keeping him company. Barbara smiled. I mostly listened to him complain about Chicago traffic. Patrick laughed. I did not complain. You absolutely did. The three of them stood laughing in the hallway. It looked like friendship, because it was. Barbara left. Vivian leaned against the closed door. You know, Cest. What? I'm glad you've had someone to talk to while I've been working so much. Patrick looked at her. I've had you. She smiled. I haven't exactly been around. He wanted to say, I've missed talking to you. Instead, he answered, We're both busy. Vivian nodded. Yeah. Neither of them realized they had just stepped around the only sentence that mattered. A few weeks later, Patrick, Vivian, Barbara, and Margaret gathered for Sunday lunch. The conversation moved easily from family news to neighborhood gossip. Barbara turned toward Patrick. Did you ever end up replacing that cracked window in your office? Patrick smiled. I finally did. Margaret looked up, not because of the question, because of Patrick's face when he answered it. It wasn't excitement. It was recognition. The expression people wear when they realize someone remembered something they had completely forgotten mentioning. Margaret quietly looked toward Vivian. Vivian was laughing with Patrick's cousin. She hadn't heard the exchange. Margaret said nothing. She simply watched, not with suspicion, with concern. On the drive home, one thought stayed with her. Barbara wasn't asking extraordinary questions. She was asking ordinary ones, the kind Patrick and Vivian had once asked each other without thinking. She never intended to step into the space between them. That space had been created long before she ever noticed it existed. Long before divorce papers, long before another wedding, long before a mother would stand in a room full of guests and ask her son the one question no one else had thought to ask. The marriage wasn't changing because someone new had entered it. It was changing because two people who still loved each other had slowly stopped discovering the person standing in front of them. And life has a quiet way of allowing someone else's ordinary curiosity to drift into the silence that certainty leaves behind. Nothing changed because someone made a bad decision. It changed because everyone believed they already understood the people they loved. Barbara continued stopping by the apartment between visits to the rehabilitation center where her father was receiving treatment. Sometimes she borrowed a novel. Sometimes she returned a casserole dish. Sometimes she stayed only long enough for coffee before heading back across the city. It never felt unusual. She had been part of Vivian's life for years. Patrick had simply become part of that friendship. One Thursday afternoon, Patrick arrived home early and found Barbara standing on the balcony, trimming the basil Vivian had planted in old ceramic pots. I think I saved it, Barbara said. Patrick looked at the drooping leaves. I wasn't nearly as optimistic. You underestimate basil. I probably do. She smiled. How'd the city inspection go? It passed. Good. Patrick reached for a bottle of water from the refrigerator. Barbara glanced over her shoulder. What ended up fixing it? Patrick paused. The inspector thought one of the foundation walls had shifted. And? It hadn't. So, what was it? A drainage issue. Barbara laughed. So everyone spent 3 days worrying about the wrong thing. Patrick laughed too. That's exactly what happened. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Barbara didn't solve anything. She didn't encourage him to open up. She simply asked one more question after hearing the first answer. Later that night, while locking the apartment door before bed, Patrick realized something he couldn't quite explain. He remembered the conversation, not because it had been important, because someone had stayed curious long enough to hear the rest of it. The following afternoon, Vivian met Barbara outside the rehabilitation center after visiting her father. They walked toward the parking garage together. Barbara adjusted the strap of her handbag. How was your week? Vivian answered automatically. Busy. Barbara smiled. I assumed that. They walked a few more steps. Then Barbara asked, What made it hard? Vivian slowed. She looked across the rows of parked cars before answering. I had to tell a family we couldn't move their mother to another facility. Barbara waited. They understood, Vivian continued. It still felt awful. Barbara nodded. I'm sorry. Vivian looked at her. I don't think anyone's asked me that in months. What? What made the week hard? Barbara frowned slightly. I thought Patrick would. Vivian smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. He asks if work was busy. And? I tell him yes. They reached their cars. Neither woman hurried to leave. Finally, Barbara asked, Do you think he already knows the rest? Vivian looked down at her keys. I think we both assume we already know each other. She closed the car door gently. The sentence stayed with Barbara long after Vivian drove away. That evening, Patrick and Vivian finally managed to eat dinner together. No laptops, no television, no interruptions. Patrick poured Vivian another glass of water. How was work? She smiled. Busy. He nodded. I'm glad you're home. I'm glad too. They talked about the leaking faucet, Patrick's mother's birthday dinner, whether they needed groceries before the weekend. The conversation was easy, comfortable, and finished before either of them noticed what had been missing. Hours earlier, Vivian had spoken openly about the hardest part of her week. At home, she never mentioned it. Patrick wasn't uninterested. He simply believed busy explained enough. Vivian believed the same thing. Neither realized certainty had quietly shortened their conversations. Sunday lunch at Margaret's house followed its familiar rhythm. Children ran through the backyard. Relatives debated baseball in the living room. Someone always forgot the dinner rolls. Patrick carried empty plates into the kitchen. Barbara followed with a bowl of salad. As she set it on the counter, she smiled. You ever finish that history book? Patrick looked surprised. I actually did. Worth reading? It was. What surprised you most? He leaned against the counter. The chapter I almost skipped. Barbara laughed. That's usually the one people remember. Margaret stood at the sink, rinsing serving spoons. She wasn't listening to the words. She was watching Patrick's face, not because Barbara fascinated him, because someone had asked a question that invited another answer. Across the room, Vivian knelt beside Patrick's young nephew, helping him fit the final pieces into a puzzle. Margaret looked from one to the other. Both were smiling. Both looked content. Yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen Patrick and Vivian become curious about each other's ordinary days. The thought came and went. She kept drying the dishes. A few evenings later, Patrick carried grocery bags into the apartment. Vivian looked up from the dining table. Did you remember the milk? He smiled. I did. Thank you. He unpacked the bags one by one. The history book crossed his mind. For a second he almost said, Barbara asked if I'd finished it. Instead, he stacked canned soup in the pantry. Across the room, Vivian opened her laptop. She almost told Patrick about her conversation with Barbara after visiting the rehabilitation center. Instead, she answered another email. Neither of them chose silence. They chose what felt ordinary. Neither believed the small stories mattered enough to interrupt the evening, and without either of them realizing it, that became the quiet habit changing their marriage. Not secrets, not betrayal. Simply two good people who had begun believing they already knew the ending of each other's sentences, and slowly stopped asking for the rest of the story. Nobody watching Patrick and Vivian would have said they were falling apart. If anything, they seemed unusually thoughtful with one another. The problem wasn't that love had disappeared. It was that both of them had quietly started loving the person they remembered, instead of discovering the person standing in front of them. One Wednesday morning, Vivian slipped out of bed before sunrise. Patrick was still asleep. She watched him for a moment before quietly leaving the apartment. On her way to work, she stopped outside the little stationery shop they'd wandered into months earlier. Patrick had picked up a leather-bound journal that day. He'd smiled, turned a few pages, then carefully placed it back on the shelf. After this project, he'd said. Vivian remembered. She bought it. When the cashier wrapped it in brown paper, she smiled. Birthday? Vivian shook her head. No. Anniversary? No. The cashier looked curious. Vivian smiled. I just remembered something he forgot. Patrick found the package waiting on his desk that evening. He smiled before opening it. His fingers rested on the cover. You remembered. Vivian looked over from the kitchen. You looked at it 3 different times. I didn't think you noticed. I noticed more than you think. For a second, neither of them spoke. Patrick walked over and kissed her forehead. I love it. So. He smiled. So, what are you going to write first? Patrick looked down at the empty pages. I'll know when I get there. His phone began vibrating across the table. Both of them looked at it. Patrick sighed. It'll take 2 minutes. Vivian smiled. I'll still be here. He answered. When Patrick returned, dinner was already on the table. The journal rested beside his chair. He picked it up. I meant what I said. I know. I'll start it tonight. I know. She believed him. He believed himself. 2 evenings later, Barbara stopped by after visiting her father. Patrick was drinking coffee on the balcony. The journal sat unopened beside him. Barbara noticed it. So, that's the famous journal. Patrick smiled. Vivian surprised me. Barbara picked it up carefully. You still haven't written anything. I keep waiting for the right first sentence. Barbara handed it back. What happened today? Patrick looked at her. What? You said you were waiting. She smiled. Something always happens. Patrick laughed quietly. I spent half my day arguing with an inspector about a staircase. There you go. What? You already have page 1. Barbara stood. I should get going. She left without saying another word. Patrick looked down at the blank page. He uncapped his pen. Then his phone buzzed again. He smiled to himself. Clever timing. He capped the pen. Tomorrow would be fine. That same afternoon, Vivian finished one of the hardest meetings she'd led all year. Afterward, she walked Barbara to the parking lot. Barbara unlocked her car. How'd it go? Vivian answered automatically. Busy. Barbara smiled. I know. She waited. Vivian looked at her, then laughed. You always wait. For what? For the real answer. Barbara shrugged. I figured there probably is one. Vivian leaned against her car. There always is. Neither woman hurried to leave. For the next 10 minutes, Vivian talked. Not about schedules, not about budgets, about the family she'd had to comfort, about the nurse who blamed herself for something no one could have prevented, about driving home, wondering whether she'd said enough. When she finally stopped, Barbara smiled. You carry a lot. Vivian nodded. So does Patrick. The sentence lingered between them. Vivian looked toward the evening traffic. I wonder when we stop telling each other that. Friday arrived with no emergencies, no inspections, no late meetings. Patrick cooked dinner. Vivian came home without opening her laptop. She noticed the journal beside his plate. You started? Patrick smiled. Not yet. She laughed. I thought you said you'd know. I keep changing my mind. She reached across the table and gently tapped the cover. Then don't write the perfect first page. Why not? Because the second page deserves a chance too. Patrick laughed. I married a surprisingly wise woman. I've always been wise. You've definitely always been confident. Dinner wasn't perfect. The chicken stayed in the oven a little too long. The vegetables were softer than either of them liked. They laughed anyway. For nearly an hour, they forgot about deadlines. Patrick told her about the staircase. Vivian told him about a patient who insisted every doctor looked too young to be trusted. They laughed until Patrick reached for his glass and almost knocked it over. Neither noticed how long it had been since laughter had filled the apartment like that. When the dishes were cleared, Vivian rested her elbows on the table. I missed tonight. Patrick looked at her. We're here now. She nodded. We are. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Hopeful. Patrick looked at the journal. Vivian looked at Patrick. Both had something they wanted to say. His phone began vibrating. Neither moved. It stopped. A few seconds later, it rang again. Vivian glanced toward the screen. The city. Patrick looked at her. I can ignore it. She smiled gently. I know you can. He waited. So can I. She reached for his hand. Answer it. You sure? She nodded. I don't want us resenting a phone call. He answered. 28 minutes later, Patrick walked back into the dining room. The dishes were washed. The lights above the table were off. Only the lamp beside the sofa remained. Vivian had fallen asleep with a blanket across her knees. Patrick stood quietly for a moment. He picked up the journal, opened to the first page. After a long pause, he wrote a single sentence. We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time. He closed the journal, slid it carefully into the bedside drawer, turned off the lamp, and told himself he'd show Vivian what he'd written tomorrow. The first time Patrick mentioned living apart, Vivian didn't answer immediately. She rinsed the coffee mug in her hands, set it on the drying rack, wiped the counter with the dish towel she'd been holding. Only then did she look at him. For how long? Patrick rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know. Do you need space? She searched his face. Or are you leaving? He looked down. I honestly don't know anymore. There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. A week later, Patrick carried one suitcase to his car. Vivian followed him outside. Before closing the trunk, she opened the front pocket. His medication was inside. He looked at her. You remembered. You usually forget it. He smiled faintly. You still know me. Vivian held his gaze. I hope I do. Neither of them realized that neither question nor answer was really about medicine. They tried to make the separation practical. Patrick still came over to repair the dripping kitchen faucet. Vivian still drove Margaret to medical appointments when Patrick was working. From the outside, they looked like two people handling an impossible season with remarkable grace. Inside, both of them were waiting for a conversation neither knew how to begin. Patrick tightened the last bolt beneath the kitchen sink. There! Vivian handed him a towel. He wiped his hands. She noticed him rotate his shoulder while standing. It doesn't hurt anymore? Patrick looked up. No. When did that happen? A couple of months ago. She smiled. I'm glad. A pause. I wish I'd known. Patrick frowned. I told you. Vivian shook her head gently. No. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His eyes drifted toward the dining table. For several long seconds, he didn't move. Then, almost to himself, oh. Vivian watched him. Patrick never finished the sentence. He folded the towel once, then again. When he finally looked back at her, his expression had changed. Not because he understood what had happened, because, for the first time, he wasn't sure. A few evenings later, Vivian found the leather journal while dusting the bookshelf. She drove it to Patrick's apartment. You left this. Patrick smiled. I've hardly touched it. She handed it back. You said you were writing. I thought I would. He opened it. Only one sentence filled the first page. We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time. Vivian read it quietly. When did you write this? The night we had dinner. The lemon chicken? He nodded. You never showed me. Patrick looked at the page. I meant to. Vivian waited. He didn't add anything else. She closed the journal gently and placed it back in his hands. Neither tried to explain the silence that followed. Time passed. Friends asked what had happened. Patrick usually answered, I don't know. Vivian usually smiled politely and changed the subject. Neither answer satisfied anyone, least of all themselves. The morning they met to sign the divorce papers, rain tapped softly against the conference room windows. There were no raised voices, no lawyers arguing, only two signatures waiting on a polished wooden table. Vivian looked across at Patrick. I only want to ask one thing. He nodded. She took a slow breath. Tell me one important thing. She stopped, started again. One important thing you were certain I knew. But, never actually told me. Patrick looked at her. His lips parted. Nothing. He glanced toward the journal resting beside his chair. Then, at his wedding ring. His thumb turned at once. Twice. He looked back at Vivian. Several long seconds passed. Finally he whispered, "I." The sentence never came. His shoulders lowered. "I don't know anymore." Vivian closed her eyes, not because she doubted him, because she believed him. That hurt more. She signed the papers, folded them neatly, placed the pen beside the folder. Patrick reached for the journal as they stood. He slipped it beneath his arm. They walked to the parking lot together. When they reached their cars, Vivian smiled sadly. "Take care of yourself." "You too." She got into her car. Patrick watched her pull away. For a moment, he took a step forward, then stopped. He opened the journal. The first page was still waiting. He read the single sentence he'd written months earlier. "We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time." He rested his thumb against the edge of the page, closed the journal, set it on the passenger seat, then drove away. Neither of them knew that the question haunting their marriage had not disappeared with the divorce. It had simply gone unanswered. And unanswered questions have a way of waiting for the moment someone finally asks them out loud. A week after the divorce became official, Vivian stood in the pharmacy, staring at a pregnancy test she hadn't planned to buy. She blamed the exhaustion on long shifts, the nausea on too much coffee, the missed cycle on stress. She picked up the box, put it back, picked it up again. The cashier smiled politely as Vivian finally placed it on the counter. Back at the apartment, she left the unopened box on the bathroom sink. She made tea, folded laundry, watered the basil on the balcony. It had survived another Chicago winter. Patrick would have smiled at that. He'd always insisted it would never make it to spring. Vivian rested her fingertips against one of the leaves. Then she went back inside. The unopened box was still waiting. A few minutes later, Vivian sat on the edge of the bathtub. She looked at the result once, then again. The answer didn't change. She lowered the test into her lap. Outside, someone laughed in the courtyard below. A delivery truck rolled past the building. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. The city carried on exactly as it had the day before. Inside the apartment, everything had quietly become different. 3 days passed before she made an appointment. The examination was routine. The doctor's smile was warm. "Everything looks healthy." Vivian nodded. "Congratulations." She smiled automatically. A heartbeat later, the smile disappeared before she seemed to notice it herself. The doctor didn't ask why. She simply slid the tissue box a little closer across the desk. When the appointment ended, Vivian carried the folder to the parking lot. As she reached her car, a young father walked ahead of her, carrying a sleeping newborn against his shoulder. The baby stirred. He instinctively adjusted the blanket without breaking his stride. Vivian watched until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did she rest one hand lightly against her stomach. Margaret called that evening. "I've been thinking about you." Vivian laughed softly. "That usually means you're about to feed me." "I brought cinnamon rolls." "You know me too well." "I've had practice." 20 minutes later, Margaret was sitting at Vivian's kitchen table. They shared one pastry, talked about work, about Margaret's roses, about the bakery changing its recipe. The conversation wandered naturally until there was nowhere else for it to go. Vivian stood, walked to the dining table, picked up the medical folder, and placed it gently in front of Margaret. Margaret opened it, read quietly, closed it again. She reached across the table and held Vivian's hand. Neither woman spoke. Neither needed to. Several days later, they met again at a small neighborhood cafe. Lunch arrived. Neither of them touched much of it. Vivian looked out the window. "I've made a decision." Margaret nodded once. "I'm not telling Patrick." She didn't react immediately. Instead, she folded her napkin into a smaller square. Only then did she ask, "May I ask you one question?" Vivian nodded. "If Patrick knew today..." Margaret's voice stayed gentle. "Would he be choosing you? Or would he be choosing the situation?" Vivian didn't answer. She looked down into her coffee. A long silence settled between them. Finally she spoke. "I don't know." Another pause. "And I don't want our child to spend a lifetime wondering that either." Margaret listened. Vivian's voice remained calm. I don't want our child growing up asking whether they were the reason two people stayed together. She swallowed. Or the reason they couldn't let go. Her eyes lifted. I wanted Patrick to choose me. A faint smile appeared. I still do. She looked back out the cafe window. But that choice has to belong to him. Margaret blinked slowly. There was nothing she could argue with. When they finally stood to leave, Margaret reached into her handbag for her keys, then stopped. She turned back toward Vivian. I want to promise you something. Vivian waited. This child will never become an argument. The words hung quietly between them. If Patrick ever learns the truth. Margaret continued. It will be because that truth belongs to his child. Oh, not because I wanted to change his decision. Vivian nodded once. Thank you. They embraced. Neither woman cried. Neither tried to be brave. They simply held each other a little longer than usual. Margaret drove home in silence. Inside the house, she walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet. She reached for 2 mugs. Her hand stopped. She slowly returned one to the shelf. The kettle began to whistle. Margaret stood still for another moment before reaching to turn off the stove. The kitchen fell quiet. So did she. The first months after the divorce were quieter than Patrick expected. Not lonelier, just quieter. He learned which grocery store stayed open late, which coffee shop remembered his order, which evenings felt longest after work. A new routine slowly formed around an old life. Barbara's father was finally well enough to return home. Patrick spent an entire Saturday helping move furniture back into the small apartment. By late afternoon, everyone was exhausted. Barbara's father looked around the living room and smiled. I've been waiting months to sit in my own chair. Patrick laughed. I don't think I've ever seen anyone happier about one chair. You will someday. The older man smiled. When life changes enough, ordinary things become extraordinary. Patrick thought about that sentence all the way home. Over the following weeks, Patrick and Barbara continued spending time together. Nothing was announced. Nothing was hidden. Their friendship simply kept arriving in places neither of them had expected. One evening, they walked through a neighborhood farmer's market. Barbara stopped to admire fresh herbs. Patrick smiled. You always look at the basil first. So does Vivian. The words escaped before he realized he'd spoken them. Silence. Barbara looked at the plants. I remember. Patrick rubbed the back of his neck. I'm sorry. For what? I didn't mean. Barbara smiled gently. You remembered something. She picked up a small basil plant. That's not something you need to apologize for. Patrick nodded, but he carried the moment with him long after they left. A few days later, they met for dinner. Halfway through the meal, Barbara asked, How's the journal? Patrick laughed. Still one sentence. You've been stuck on page 1 for months. I know. She smiled. What do you think page 2 is waiting for? Patrick started to answer, then stopped. He looked toward the restaurant window. I don't know. Barbara didn't rescue the silence. She simply waited. Finally, Patrick said, I used to think the hard part was finding the right words. And now? I think. He looked down at his hands. Maybe I never finished the first conversation. Neither of them spoke for a while. The waiter quietly refilled their water glasses before walking away again. Not long afterward, Patrick invited Barbara to a small architecture exhibition downtown. As they wandered through the gallery, they stopped in front of a display showing the restoration of a century-old church. Patrick studied the photographs. The builders repaired almost everything. Barbara looked closer. They still left one wall. Patrick nodded. It wasn't damaged. Then why didn't they restore it? The architect wanted people to remember where the original building ended. Barbara stood quietly beside him. So sometimes leaving something unfinished is part of preserving the truth. Patrick didn't answer. The words settled somewhere deeper than either of them expected. Friends gradually realized Patrick and Barbara were no longer simply spending time together. Some celebrated. Some kept their opinions to themselves. Patrick never argued with anyone. Barbara never defended herself. Neither believed they had done anything wrong. Neither believed the situation was simple. One evening, Patrick visited Margaret. She served soup and fresh bread. The conversation drifted from work to baseball to the neighbor's new puppy. As Patrick prepared to leave, Margaret asked casually, "Have you been happy?" Patrick smiled. "I think so." She nodded. "I didn't ask whether life has become easier." Patrick looked at her. "I asked whether you've been happy." He opened his mouth. Nothing came immediately. Margaret didn't wait for an answer. She simply hugged him goodbye. Patrick drove home with the question following him through every traffic light. A few nights later, Barbara stopped by his condominium. Patrick was making coffee. She wandered into the study. The leather journal rested where it always had. She recognized it instantly. Her hand reached toward it, then stopped. She smiled to herself. No. When Patrick returned carrying 2 mugs, the journal was exactly where he'd left it. "What are you smiling about?" Barbara accepted the coffee. "I almost did something." "What?" "I almost read your journal." Patrick laughed. "You would have found 1 sentence. That's still yours." He looked at the journal, then back at her. "Thank you." Barbara shrugged. "I don't need to know everything you're thinking." She smiled. "I'd rather hear it when you're ready." Patrick looked at her for a long moment. Something about those words unsettled him, not because Barbara had done anything wrong, because he suddenly couldn't remember the last time he had allowed someone to finish becoming known, instead of assuming he already understood them. He picked up the journal, opened to the first page, read the familiar sentence. Then, for the first time in months, he turned to the second page. His pen rested above the paper. He didn't write. But he didn't close the journal either. The page remained open long after the coffee had gone cold. Patrick wasn't looking for the past. He was looking for a building permit. A client had asked for revisions on a project completed years earlier, and the original approval had been attached to an old email. He sat alone in his study on a quiet Tuesday evening. The apartment was still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. He opened his archived inbox and typed a few keywords into the search bar. The permit appeared. So did dozens of emails from Vivian. For a moment, he smiled. There were grocery lists, photographs from weekend trips, a recipe for lemon chicken she'd insisted he could make better than any restaurant, reminders to pick up dry cleaning, a picture of the basil plant after its first winter, pieces of an ordinary life. He almost closed the window. Then one subject line caught his eye. "Can we please talk before we decide?" Patrick frowned. He didn't remember it. He clicked. The message opened. "Patrick, I don't know if we're trying to solve the right problem anymore. If I've hurt you, I need to understand how. I don't want us to keep answering questions the other person never asked. Please don't let silence make this decision for us. I love you enough to hear something difficult, if it means we're finally talking about the same thing. Vivian." Patrick read it again, then a third time. His eyes drifted to the top of the screen. Unread, he stared at the word. His first thought was simple. That can't be right. He checked the date. 3 weeks before he suggested living apart. He checked the time. 7:42 p.m. Without thinking, he reached for his desk calendar. The old paper planner was still tucked inside the bottom drawer. He turned to that week. No client dinner, no business trip, no evening meeting. He had been home. Patrick leaned back in his chair. He tried to remember that night. Nothing unusual came to mind. No argument, no emergency, no reason, just an email that had waited quietly for an answer that never came. He closed the laptop, opened it again. Read the message once more. The apartment felt strangely unfamiliar, not because anything inside it had changed, because one ordinary email had made him question something he had believed for years. He walked into the kitchen, filled a glass with water, set it down untouched. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. The next afternoon, Patrick drove to Margaret's house without calling first. She was kneeling in the garden, trimming back her rose bushes. She looked up and smiled. "I wasn't expecting company." "I know." She stood and brushed the dirt from her gardening gloves. "You look tired." Patrick nodded. "I found something." Margaret didn't ask what. She simply led him to the back porch and poured 2 glasses of iced tea. For a while, they listened to birds moving through the trees. Patrick finally spoke. "I found an email." Margaret looked at him. "I never opened it." Another silence. Patrick stared into his glass. "She asked me to talk." Margaret waited. "I didn't even know she'd asked." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought—" Oh, he stopped. Tried again. "I thought she had stopped trying." Margaret rested both hands around her glass. Then she asked one question. "Are you certain that's what happened? Or is that what you believed happened?" Patrick looked at her. For the first time in months, he didn't have an answer. That evening, he returned home long after dark. The journal still rested on his desk. He opened it, read the first sentence. "We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time." He turned to the second page. His pen hovered above the paper. He wrote one word. "Why?" He looked at it. A few seconds later, he drew a slow line through it, closed the journal, turned off the desk lamp. The second page remained blank. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, something far more difficult had begun. For the first time since the divorce, Patrick wasn't searching for proof that he had made the wrong decision. He was no longer certain he had ever fully understood the right one. Patrick didn't search for more emails. He didn't reread old text messages. For several days, he avoided all of it. The unread message from Vivian remained open in his mind long after he had closed the laptop. He found himself reaching for his phone more than usual, starting conversations, stopping halfway through. Even ordinary questions suddenly felt different. One afternoon, a young architect on his team stopped by his office. "I've got 2 options for the entrance." Patrick looked over the drawings. "They'll both work. Which one do you want?" Patrick almost answered. Then he looked back at the plans. "Walk me through why you chose each one." The younger architect blinked in surprise. For 10 minutes, Patrick listened without interrupting. When the conversation ended, the architect smiled. "Thanks." "For what?" "For letting me finish." Patrick sat alone after he left. The words stayed with him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had thanked him for simply listening. That weekend, Emily invited him over to help sort old family photographs. She handed him a stack. "These are yours." Patrick smiled. "I didn't know I still had these." He flipped through birthdays, road trips, holiday dinners. One photograph caught his attention. Vivian stood in Margaret's kitchen wearing an apron, laughing so hard she had one hand against the counter for balance. Patrick frowned. "I thought she left early that night." Emily looked over. "No, you'd gone back to the office." Patrick nodded slowly. "I remember that." Emily continued sorting photographs. "She stayed because she thought you'd come back after you finished." Patrick looked at the picture again. He didn't answer. For years, he had remembered that evening as another night work had simply gotten in the way. He had never known Vivian had waited. The photograph wasn't proving him wrong. It was reminding him how much of someone else's evening he had never seen. A few evenings later, Patrick stopped by Margaret's house. She was in the backyard, trimming the basil that somehow survived every season. "You still have it." Margaret smiled. "Some things grow better when you stop checking on them every day." Patrick laughed quietly. "I don't think that's how gardening works." "It isn't." She set the scissors down. "But it works for people sometimes." They stood together without speaking. The wind moved gently through the leaves. Finally, Patrick asked, "Did Vivian stop talking to me? Or did I stop hearing her?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She brushed a loose leaf from the table, then looked at her son. "I don't think either of those things happened." Patrick waited. "I think you slowly stopped asking the question after the first answer." He frowned slightly. "I don't understand. When people have been together a long time," Margaret said softly, "they sometimes finish each other's sentences." Patrick nodded. "They also begin finishing each other's thoughts." Another pause. "And sometimes." "Is there—" Wrong. Nothing else needed to be said. Patrick looked at the basil. For years, he had believed knowing someone deeply meant predicting what they would say. He had never considered that love might require continuing to ask anyway. The following Saturday, Patrick opened the last unopened box from his move. Most of it held ordinary things: extension cords, old notebooks, instruction manuals. Near the bottom lay a small white envelope in Vivian's handwriting. He recognized it immediately. It had been tucked inside the pocket of the coat he wore during one of their anniversary weekends. He opened it carefully. Inside was a movie ticket, a receipt from their favorite pizza place, and a folded note. Patrick unfolded it. "I know work matters." The next line made him stop. "I just miss laughing with you." Nothing more. No accusation, no disappointment, no request that he become someone different. Only a quiet truth. Patrick lowered the paper. He could remember apologizing for missing the movie. He could remember promising to make it up to her. He could not remember asking the simplest question: "How long have you been feeling this way?" That realization hurt more than the note itself, not because he had failed once, because he had never known there was another conversation waiting behind the first one. Late that night, Patrick sat at his desk. The journal rested where it always had. He opened it. The first page still read, "We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time." He slipped Vivian's note inside the cover. He didn't write. He didn't reach for the pen. He simply closed the journal and rested his hand on it. Outside, traffic continued across the bridge. Inside, Patrick finally understood something he wished he had learned years earlier. Listening wasn't the same as understanding, and believing you already knew someone could become the quietest way to stop discovering them. He turned off the desk lamp. The room disappeared into darkness. The journal remained on the desk, waiting, like every unfinished conversation he was only now beginning to hear. After finding Vivian's note, Patrick stopped trying to silence his questions. He also stopped rushing to answer them. For the first time in years, he discovered that uncertainty wasn't something to escape. Sometimes it was something to sit with. Barbara noticed the change before Patrick mentioned it. He paused more often, asked follow-up questions, listened longer than he used to. Even simple conversations felt different. One Saturday morning they met for breakfast at the neighborhood cafe where they had become regulars. The waitress poured coffee without asking for their order. Patrick smiled. "She knows us." Barbara laughed. "I guess we've become predictable." Patrick stirred his coffee. "Maybe that's not always a good thing." Barbara looked at him. "You've been saying things like that a lot lately." He nodded. "I know." Neither spoke for a while. As they left the cafe, Barbara asked quietly, "Is this about the email?" Patrick stopped walking. "I told you about that." "You didn't have to. You've been carrying it into every conversation." Patrick looked down the street. "I keep thinking about one sentence." Barbara waited. "Please don't let silence make this decision for us." He shook his head gently. "I never read it." Barbara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "What do you think would have happened if you had?" Patrick smiled sadly. "I don't know." Another pause. "I hate that I don't know." Several days later, Barbara invited Patrick to help organize old family paperwork at her father's apartment. Boxes covered the dining room table. Medical records, insurance forms, old birthday cards. Her father eventually wandered into the kitchen to make tea, leaving the two of them sorting papers together. Barbara picked up an old greeting card. "My father keeps everything." Patrick laughed. "So did Vivian." The words came naturally. Barbara smiled. "I remember." Patrick looked at the card in his hands. "I've been remembering a lot lately." Barbara nodded. "I can see that." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When Vivian and I disagreed, how often did I ask you what she meant?" Barbara looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. She searched her memory instead. "More than I realized." Patrick lowered his eyes. "And how often did you answer?" Barbara let out a slow breath. "I thought you wanted help." "I know. I never thought I was choosing sides." Patrick nodded. "I know." Neither of them sounded angry. That made the conversation even harder. Barbara sat down at the dining table. "I used to tell myself." She stopped, then tried again. "I thought I understood Vivian." Patrick remained quiet. We'd been friends since college. I knew how she handled stress. I knew when she was afraid to disappoint people. She looked at Patrick. So when you'd ask me what she meant, I answered. Patrick leaned against the kitchen counter. Did you ever tell her? Barbara frowned. Tell her what? That I wasn't asking her. The room fell silent. Barbara looked toward the window. Cars moved slowly along the street outside. A child rode past on a bicycle. Life continued. Inside the apartment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Barbara whispered, I don't think I ever did. Patrick closed his eyes. Not because he blamed her, because he suddenly understood how easily something ordinary could become permanent. Barbara spoke first. I never wanted to stand between the two of you. I know. I honestly believed I was helping. Patrick looked at her. I believe you. She blinked. I should have told you to ask Vivian. Patrick nodded once. I should have asked her. Neither sentence erased the other. Both could be true. When Patrick left that afternoon, he drove without turning on the radio. He replayed dozens of conversations in his mind. Not the words, the pattern. A question, an answer, another question, another answer. So many of those answers had come from someone who loved them both. Not because she wanted control, because everyone involved believed they were making communication easier. Patrick realized something that unsettled him more than any unread email. The habit had never felt dangerous. That was why no one had questioned it. 2 evenings later, Barbara knocked on Margaret's front door. Margaret welcomed her inside. They sat in the living room with cups of tea between them. Barbara stared at the steam rising from her mug. I've been thinking about something. Margaret waited. I spent years believing I was helping them understand each other. A long silence followed. Barbara looked down. What if I slowly taught them to stop understanding each other for themselves? Margaret didn't rush to answer. Finally, she said, Love has a quiet way of making us believe we know what's best for people. Barbara looked up. I never wanted to replace Vivian's voice. I know. Margaret's reply came without hesitation. I don't think you ever wanted that. Barbara's eyes filled. But intentions don't always become outcomes. Margaret reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. No, they don't. That night, Patrick arrived home later than usual. The apartment was silent. He walked into his study. The journal rested on the desk. He opened it. The folded note from Vivian remained tucked inside the cover. He unfolded it once more. I just miss laughing with you. He read the sentence slowly. Then he reached for a blank sheet of paper beside the journal. At the top, he wrote a single question. When did I stop asking Vivian? And start asking everyone else? He looked at the words for a long time. He didn't try to answer them. For the first time, he understood that some questions weren't meant to produce immediate answers. They were meant to change the person asking them. He folded the paper, placed it inside the journal, closed the cover, and quietly turned off the light. The morning of the wedding arrived with surprising ordinariness. Patrick woke before sunrise. For several minutes, he remained in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside his apartment. Nothing felt dramatic. Nothing felt final. That unsettled him more than either would have. He walked into the kitchen, started the coffee maker. While it brewed, he found himself looking out the window instead of checking his phone. The unread email had stopped replaying in his mind exactly as it had been written. Instead, it had become something else. A question, not about Vivian, about himself. Across the city, Vivian buttoned her coat before leaving for work. She paused in front of the hallway mirror. Her reflection hadn't changed enough for anyone else to notice. She rested one hand lightly against her stomach, only for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and locked the apartment behind her. She had promised herself long ago that she would not measure her future by Patrick's choices. Today would not change that promise, even if it hurt. Margaret arrived at the church early, just as she always arrived early for family milestones. The florist was arranging the final bouquet. The pianist practiced quietly. Volunteers straightened the programs one last time. Margaret greeted everyone warmly. She thanked the coordinator, complimented the flowers. smiled for photographs. No one noticed that every few minutes her eyes wandered toward the empty altar, not because she doubted the wedding would happen, because she wasn't sure every question had been asked yet. Barbara spent the morning helping her father fasten his cufflinks. His hands were steadier than they had been months earlier. Recovery had given him patience. "You seem quiet," he said. Barbara smiled. "I've been thinking. That's usually dangerous." She laughed softly. "I know." He adjusted his jacket. "Nervous?" "A little." "About getting married?" Barbara looked out the window. "No." He waited. "I'm wondering whether certainty and peace are the same thing." Her father considered the question. "I've never thought they were." Barbara nodded slowly. Neither of them tried to explain further. Patrick arrived at the church shortly before the guests began filling the sanctuary. Friends greeted him with easy smiles. His best man straightened his tie. Someone joked about married life. Patrick laughed at the right moments. He appreciated every kindness. Still, he found himself watching conversations more than participating in them. People interrupted one another, finished each other's sentences, laughed before the punchline arrived. For the first time in years, Patrick wondered how often people believed they understood someone before that person had finished speaking. His best man noticed the silence. "You doing all right?" Patrick smiled faintly. "I think so. You don't sound convinced." Patrick looked toward the chapel doors. "I've spent weeks realizing how many questions I never asked." His best man frowned. "What kind of questions?" Patrick thought for a long moment. "The ones you don't realize matter until years later." The answer surprised both of them. Guests slowly filled the pews. Emily sat beside Margaret. She leaned over. "You okay?" Margaret nodded. "I'm thinking." Emily smiled. "You've always done that." Margaret returned the smile. Sometimes thinking arrives too late. Emily glanced toward Patrick at the altar. "Do you think he's happy?" Margaret looked at her son. "I think he's trying very hard to be honest." There was a difference. Margaret wasn't sure everyone could see it. Barbara stood outside the sanctuary with her bouquet. The wedding coordinator smiled. "Ready?" Barbara took a slow breath. "I hope so." The coordinator laughed gently. "That's more honest than most brides." Barbara smiled. As the doors remained closed for another minute, she remembered something Patrick had said weeks earlier. "I don't know if I ever finished the first conversation." At the time, she hadn't fully understood. Now she wasn't certain she had either. The thought lingered. Then the music began. Patrick took his place at the altar. The historic church settled into a respectful hush. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, spilling muted colors across the wooden floor. The sanctuary looked exactly as he had imagined it would, only he no longer felt exactly as he had imagined he would. Barbara appeared at the end of the aisle beside her father. She smiled. Patrick smiled back. There was kindness between them. Respect, affection. Neither doubted those things. Yet beneath Patrick's calm expression lived a question that refused to disappear. Not whether Barbara was the right person, not whether Vivian had been the wrong one. Something simpler, something far more difficult. Had he truly listened to either of them? Barbara reached the altar. Her father gently placed her hand in Patrick's. The officiant welcomed everyone. He spoke about commitment, about trust, about choosing one another again and again over the course of a lifetime. Patrick listened carefully, perhaps more carefully than he had ever listened before. The officiant smiled. "Before we begin..." He paused. "Is there anything that should be said before these vows are made?" A chair moved softly against the wooden floor. Margaret stood. She did not rush. She did not look toward Barbara. She did not look at the guests. She looked only at her son. Patrick met her eyes, for the first time since reading Vivian's email. He didn't brace himself for an answer. He realized he was waiting for a question, and in that silent moment, before Margaret spoke, Patrick understood that some questions arrived too late to preserve the past, but just in time to protect the future. Margaret remained standing. The church was silent enough that Patrick could hear his own breathing. She looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn when teaching him difficult lessons as a boy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse Barbara. She didn't defend Vivian. She simply asked, "Before you promise the rest of your life to Barbara, can you honestly say every reason you divorced Vivian came from conversations you actually had with your wife? Or from conclusions you accepted because someone else interpreted your marriage for you?" No one moved. Patrick felt the question settle over years of memories. He remembered asking Barbara what Vivian meant instead of asking Vivian herself. He remembered assuming silence meant agreement. He remembered answering conversations before they had finished. The sanctuary waited. Barbara slowly lowered her bouquet, not because she suddenly believed she had stolen someone's life, because she realized Margaret hadn't asked whether Patrick loved her. She had asked whether he had understood his first marriage. Those were different questions. Patrick looked from Margaret to Barbara, then back again. His voice was quiet. "I don't know." No excuse followed, no defense. He took a slow breath. "I thought I knew." Another pause. "I don't anymore." The words echoed through the church more powerfully than any argument could have. Patrick turned toward Barbara. "I'm sorry." She searched his face. He continued, "Not because of today. Because I asked you to help me understand a marriage that only Vivian and I were supposed to understand." Barbara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there were tears she made no attempt to hide. "I answered." Patrick nodded. "I know. I thought I was helping." "I know." Neither sentence erased the other. Neither needed to. The officiant quietly stepped back. For the first time in his career, he understood that no ceremony should continue while the truth was still arriving. Margaret walked toward the front of the sanctuary. She stopped beside Patrick. Then she spoke softly enough that the room leaned in to hear. "Vivian asked one thing of me." Patrick looked at her. "If you ever came back." "It had to be because you found your own way back." She swallowed. "Not because guilt forced you." Patrick stared at her. Margaret continued, "She told me she never wanted obligation to become the reason you loved her." Silence settled over the room. Then Margaret took one slow breath. "A week after the divorce, Vivian discovered she was pregnant." The words landed without drama, without music, without disbelief, only silence. Patrick didn't speak. He couldn't. He wasn't thinking about the child. Not first. He was thinking about Vivian, sitting alone with that news. Thinking about the choice she had made. Thinking about how deeply she had protected his freedom, even while carrying a future that belonged to both of them. Barbara lowered her eyes. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I answered questions that never belonged to me." Margaret looked at her gently. "You loved them both." Barbara nodded through tears. "I did. And somehow I made it easier for them to stop talking to each other." Patrick shook his head. "No." He finally found his voice. "I made that possible. I kept asking everyone except the one person I should have asked." No one argued with him, because no one needed to. The truth had finally reached everyone in the room. The officiant quietly closed the ceremony book. "I don't believe any promise should be made today." No one objected. Guests slowly began leaving the pews. There were no raised voices, no scandal, only people walking away with a deeper understanding of how quietly a marriage can be lost. Patrick remained standing until the church had almost emptied. For the first time in years, he stopped wishing someone would tell him what to do next. 1 year later, Patrick stood outside a neighborhood park. His hands were empty. No flowers, no speeches prepared, no expectations. Vivian saw him before he reached the bench. Their little child laughed nearby, chasing bubbles across the grass with other children. Patrick smiled without taking his eyes off the child. "I've missed enough already." Vivian studied him for a long moment. "You've been here every week." Patrick nodded. "I said I would." "And you have." Another quiet moment passed. Finally, Patrick looked at her. "I'm not here asking you to take me back." Vivian didn't answer. "I'm asking whether I've earned the chance to keep showing up." She watched their child run toward the playground. Then she looked back at Patrick. "Trust isn't something you ask for." He nodded. "I know. It's something children notice before adults do. Patrick smiled faintly. Then that's where I'll begin. Vivian returned the smallest of smiles. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, something steadier. Hope. Their child ran toward them, laughing. Patrick knelt instinctively. Small arms wrapped around his neck. For a brief moment, there were no complicated questions. Only a father learning not to miss another ordinary moment. Later that afternoon, after they walked home from the park, Patrick sat alone for a few minutes before leaving. He opened the leather journal Vivian had once given him. The first page still read, "We keep finding our way back to each other, but never at the same time." He turned to the second page. This time, he didn't hesitate. He wrote one sentence. "Today, I asked before I assumed." He closed the journal, looked toward the park where Vivian and their child were still laughing together. Some conversations arrive in time to save a marriage. Others arrive too late for that, but they can still save the people willing to keep asking and keep listening. Before you go, I'd love to ask you one question. Have you ever realized too late that someone wasn't asking for perfection? They were simply asking to be heard? If this story stayed with you, share your answer in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe the strongest relationships are built not by always having the right answers, but by never stopping the conversation, subscribe to the Greer Stories and join our family. Every week, we share heartfelt stories that remind us how ordinary moments can change extraordinary lives. Until next time, take care of the people you love. Ask one more question. Listen a little longer. And never assume today's silence tells you everything about someone's heart.